Species unite.
Species unite.
It's like, comparing hells. It's a different type of hell, right? It's just like one hideous place where you're neglected and you have all manner of suffering, to another place, where it's a different set of conditions of suffering and misery.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. We'd like to thank Lush for sponsoring today's episode. Lush advocates for people, animals, and the planet. Through their ethically sourced ingredients and their grants program, they give back locally and around the world. This conversation took place a couple of weeks ago. It's with me and Dr. Alka Chandna. Alka is PETA's Vice President of Laboratory Investigations. When we did this conversation live, I called it The Realities of Animal Testing, which is a pretty horrible name because nobody really wants to know the realities of animal testing. But I think it's so important that we do know. But because the more we know, the more we can change. Alka has been with PETA for 20 years, and she's been fighting for animal rights much longer than that. We're here today with Dr. Alka Chandna. Thank you very much for being here. It is really, really cool to have you on the show.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure and honor, Elizabeth. Thank you for having me.
You've been at PETA 20 years. Happy anniversary.
Thank you.
And so you've really been in this, and you've been an activist longer than that, fighting all of these injustices toward animals. Will you talk about what you do at PETA?
Certainly, Beth. Yeah. So at PETA, I serve as Vice President of Laboratory Investigations Cases. Through most of my 20 years at PETA, I've been focused on animal experimentation issues. And we do casework, which means that we basically pull back the curtain on what's happening to animals in laboratories. And that might be through undercover investigations. It might be through work with whistleblowers, people who work in the laboratory and are just tired of hearing these animals scream in anguish and want to do something. So they call us. Or it might be through basically reviewing what's going on with animals in laboratories by reading published papers written by the animal experimenters, looking at what the universities are parading, with their news releases, talking about different animal experiments that have been done, reading the scientific literature and journals, just keeping our finger on the pulse of what's going on. And when we see these issues, we have to be very selective, and we determine what we're going to go after, build campaigns on. And basically, I work with our scientists and our other departments, our campaigns people, to build campaigns and make sure that these issues are out there.
One of the reasons we're calling this The Realities of Animal Testing was because I just had Lisa Jones-Engel on recently. And every time I talk to somebody about experimentation and testing, a new kind of reality hits me, something that I hadn't actually thought of before. And with her, it was imports. And
Yes.
A lot of the primates that are imported for testing come from the wild, even though it's not legal for them to, but they do. And she told this whole story about how that happens. And it made me start thinking about something I've never really thought enough about. I've never looked at this through the whole kind of what happens to these animals from the time they're born, where they live, the suppliers, to getting to a lab. I was hoping we could just take it apart for a minute. Anyone who's not imported, which is pretty much anyone other than a primate, right?
Yeah.
Is born in the US with a supplier, is what they're called. Will you talk about what their life is like pre-lab and how they get to the lab?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Well, I imagine that a lot of your listeners are probably familiar with factory farms, where animals are raised in close confinement and bred into existence. There are female animals who are kept as basically, quote unquote, breeding machines. Intensive confinement, neglect of animals. The animals are seen as a means to an end. And because you have so many of them crammed into one place, if some die, and many do, you don't worry about it. Well, it's that type of facility that we see in the experimentation industry as well. So you have, people who are breeding rabbits to sell to laboratories, mice, rats, guinea pigs, hamsters, chinchillas, ferrets, like sort of the whole cornucopia of animals, are being bred in intensive confinement in these warehouses, ramshackle facilities where there's very little veterinary care. I mean, really no meaningful veterinary care to speak of. And animals, again, are seen as widgets in this machine, and this profit-driven machine. So when they die in large numbers, it doesn't really matter to the owners of the facility because the numbers are so much bigger that those animals are just seen as economic losses. And the suffering of the animals really amounts to nothing. If people are interested in diving more into this, they can go to our website, PETA.org. We have a few different big web features exposing who these entities are. And all of them, bar none, are hideous places. And federal inspectors, for example, with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, have gone into these places, repeatedly cite them for lack of veterinary care, for deplorable conditions. We're talking about animals like rabbits who are kept on wire floor cages that are barely bigger than their bodies. And, they might, because of the massive numbers of animals who are held in these facilities, there's a lot of ammonia in the air from all the urine. And they, develop sores around their eyes, on their bodies. Nothing's done for them. It's just unmitigated suffering. And that's the beginning.
So that's what they're born into. And
Yes.
I think the public learned a lot about this. I mean, not a lot, but thought about it for a minute, I guess, with the Envigo dogs, which was a breeding facility for beagles, thousands and thousands of beagles kept in deplorable conditions, which you guys shut down. Well done.
Well,
but is it kind of like factory farming also in the sense that, yes, when there's a success in terms of shutting a place down, that same thing's happening everywhere else? Like, well, this is actually happening in every factory farm in America. Is that kind of the same thing with the suppliers?
yes, exactly. And of course, like when we have a victory like in Vigo, we celebrate it for all it's worth because it's huge. But we also see, as you said just now, Beth, I mean, what's happening in Vigo was hideous beyond, but it's not distinct from what's happening elsewhere. Whether you're talking about Ridgeland Farms in Wisconsin or you're talking about Marshall in upstate New York, or any of the other facilities that breed animals to then be sold to laboratories. I mean, the basic recipe is the same. Take animals, cram them into a tiny place, deprive them of veterinary care, keep your costs low by doing that, cram them together, breed these animals, and then sell off the babies to laboratories. I mean, that's the recipe, and it means unmitigated suffering for the animals, and a lot of deaths. But who cares? That's sort of how the industry sees it. But I mean, I guess even as we have this one victory, massive victory with these thousands of dogs who are rescued, and also importantly, public awareness of the fact that this is going on. I mean, when I talk to people about what I do for a living, most people are really shocked to learn that dogs are used in experimentation, that cats are used in experimentation. Oversight is negligible to nothing. And the animals, it's perfectly legal to use them in these cruel, invasive, painful experiments and kill them at the end. There's so much lack of awareness among the public, and that's by design. The industry wants lack of awareness, and that's what they deliver. So when we have something like in Vigo, a big expose investigation, it's an opportunity to sort of open the door for the public to see what's really happening to animals who are caught up in this awful system.
And it's hard with the general public because when the Envigo thing happened, I had so many people say to me, I didn't know we tested on dogs. And
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
People are horrified. But because of how the news is and because of how our brains are now, things stay in like the consciousness for a very short time, and then people forget. And those dogs are just a tiny little percentage of all the dogs and of all the animals that are currently in these same kind of places, living the exact same kind of existences. So they start there. And then when do they go to the labs? How old are they?
It depends on what the lab requests. Some labs want young puppies, so they'll be getting puppies who are, say, 6 months old. I mean, it's like buying from a catalog. In fact, it's not like buying from a catalog. It is buying from a catalog. If you go to look at some of the purchase requisitions that you can have, from these companies that breed and sell animals, that's exactly what it is. You say, do you want male or female? Do you want, what age do you want? And, there are different groups, and you can check that off. And you're told what the price is going to be for these different groups. Do you want neutered, not neutered, et cetera? It is. It's like the Sears catalog for animals who you're going to then torment and kill in a laboratory.
Then these animals end up in labs, which are worse probably than where they just came from. I mean, they're worse because they're going to be experimented on now, and the conditions probably aren't much better.
Yeah, it's like, comparing hells. It's a different type of hell, right? It's just like one hideous place where you're neglected and you have all manner of suffering, to another place, where it's a different set of conditions of suffering and misery. I mean, none of these places are going to be treating dogs like the loyal, wonderful, loving companions that they are, or treating any of the other animals, as the intelligent, sensitive, sentient beings that they are. In all places, you're having neglect, suffering, emotional distress, and eventually, in the laboratories, they're killed.
We have like biomedical laboratories that are usually privately owned, and then universities, and then NIH funded labs. Is that the main three?
Yeah, you can sort of categorize, the whole, like I always say, the vivisection industrial complex. But you're right, Beth, that you've got your private laboratories. So, there are what they call contract laboratories. Here we're talking about players like Covance, which was bought by LabCorp. Charles River is a big contract laboratory. Alta Sciences, huge contract lab. So if I'm, let's say, a pharmaceutical maker, or I make industrial chemicals or products, consumer products that I want tested, I can go to a contract laboratory and say, here's my new, thing, my pharmaceutical. Will you test it on dogs and monkeys and guinea pigs, and then the contract lab does exactly that. They do the testing, and which I want to talk about. So they're testing for, toxicity. Is it poisonous? Maybe efficacy. Does it work in the way we want it to work? So will it reduce blood pressure, in these animals, that sort of thing. So these are contract labs that are contracted, by entities that make different products to test stuff on animals. Then you've got, as you said, the universities, the universities who are in large part funded by the National Institutes of Health. Every year, NIH, which is a massive government agency. So it's funded entirely by tax dollars, and it has a budget of $45 billion, billion with the B, annual budget. So about half of NIH's money goes to animal testing, and that's dispersed by the grant system to all of these different universities. And then you also have other commercial labs. They might be creating medical devices, developing medical devices, and then they use animals as proof of concept. And then many pharmaceutical companies have their own internal laboratories as well. So there's a lot of abuse. The military uses animals in testing. Other agencies like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has animal laboratories. NIH has its own animal laboratories. So there are all these government laboratories as well. So I think broadly speaking, I think of like commercial labs, university labs, and government labs.
this morning, I went on a few websites for different universities just to see what they said about their animal testing. It's insane. Every single one has these big disclaimers about the welfare of their animals is the most important thing that happens there. And their animals are so incredibly well taken care of. I mean, that's the narrative. It's crazy to me that in 2023, with Gen Z going to these schools, that this is still okay. I would just think Gen Z would be more, just because they're so much more aware than so many generations before them about this kind of stuff, that there would be more of a fight from students.
You're absolutely right, Beth, that like, you know, when I think about when I went to school and when I was in high school and, you know, in the biology classes, they did cat dissections, you know, and I think now about how at PETA, you know, the phones just ring off the hook from students who don't want to dissect animals, you know, cats or frogs or any other animals. They just don't want to dissect anymore. And it's an issue, you know, to the point where there are choice policies in different states that allow kids not to participate in that. And the school is required to give those students an alternative. And more than that, there are schools that are saying, hey, well, all these studies show that dissection doesn't even help students, you know, pedagogically speaking. You don't learn anything from dissection except you remember that formaldehyde stinks. You know, but if we really want to teach our students about anatomy or physiology or anything else, we really need to use these modern alternatives. There is this, you know, generational shift where the use of animals in these manners is just not accepted. When I was in grad school, even, so I was, you know, in my early 20s, mid 20s, I became aware that there were even primate laboratories at my university, which was pretty shocking. But, you know, as a student, I was involved in animal rights back then. This is like 1987 to 92 is when I was in grad school. You know, so late 1980s, early 1990s. So in that period, I was running an animal rights group with some of my friends, and you know, we had a big presence on campus, but you know, the extent to which we could really have an impact was kind of limited. You know, there are all of these big systems in place, you know, from funding to tenure, frankly, at universities. You know, professors do what they want, and the university administration really protecting and defending the, you know, quote unquote right of these animal experimenters to do what they were doing, you know, whatever the consequences to the animal and how inconsequential the studies were to human health or science in general. So, you know, students can be outraged, you know, and we know from working with them across the country that students are outraged by what's going on in laboratories. I always say more power to people, you know, rising up and saying this is wrong. But I think that the universities also know that they have a lot of power. And I think when you look at these websites and you see these claims of, you know, stringent animal regulations, animal welfare regulations, or, you know, we really care about the animals. I've even had a vivisector say to me once, we treat our, you know, animals like, you know, your pets. And I thought, well, you're never cat sitting for me. You can stay the heck away.
Head open.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But, you know, when you see that, what you're really seeing is a response to the animal rights movement and increased opposition on the part of the public to animal experimentation. It's because of that opposition, you know, because we've grown as a movement and we've been successful in opening these doors and showing people what's going on, that the universities and private entities, commercial labs, et cetera, contract labs, they feel obligated to have this veneer or this, you know, window dressing of, oh, you know, we respect animals, or, you know, whatever nonsense they pay somebody to write.
For universities, keeping this going and keeping animals in these labs, is it just strictly money because so much money goes into this?
Some of my colleagues come from the animal experimentation side of things. You know, they did their PhDs in, you know, biological sciences and were essentially forced is a bit of a strong word they were told that they needed to use animals to get their PhDs and help human beings. It's the big lie that using animals in experimentation is somehow going to help human beings. But this is the lie that, young people, they go in, they respect their professors. They're being told that this is how we do biological sciences. This is how we learn about disease and figure out how to solve disease. And they buy into it. And I think that I know that there are people who go in and they just buy this premise that this is important and decide that they have to ignore the animals suffering. They don't listen, and as and I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, I mean, in laboratories that use dogs, they often debark the dogs. They basically cut the vocal cords because they don't want to hear the dogs, yelping in pain or being distressed and lonely and, wanting companionship and barking to express that. And they just don't want to hear it. But I think people go in eyes, like with this feeling that they're going to be helping and that, the quote unquote sacrifice of the animals is just the price that has to be paid, obviously, by the animals. So they have a sincere desire to advance science. I don't want to vilify everybody in that industry, but I think that as years go on, people just have to dig in their heels to think, yes, this is going to help. This is going to help. This is going to help. And what we see is that people create these trajectories. They have a trajectory of a career that's, decades long, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, and they're doing the same awful experiments. They're still, cutting into the heads of monkeys and implanting electrodes and doing all of this stuff. And they know, I think if they're in a quiet place by themselves, they know that all they've done is write a whole bunch of papers, gathered a whole bunch of funding from the government or elsewhere, and they have the respect of their colleagues. That's what they have, and those are the parameters. That universities and other entities are using to say, oh, somebody's done well. Some years ago, Beth, we had a campaign against maternal deprivation experiments with monkeys. And this is 2014, 2015, when this happened. So it's not that long ago.
Will you explain what that is?
Yes. So I imagine that many of your listeners have heard that name, Harry Harlow. He was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's considered to be the father of maternal deprivation experiments with monkeys. And basically that means that you breed monkeys in your laboratory, you remove the babies, shortly after they're born, the day of or a few days later, you remove the babies. And that's maternal deprivation. You're permanently removing the babies from their mothers. The mothers never see those babies again. The babies never see their moms again. And then Harlow did, various things, determining whether what the baby missed from the mother was the nourishment, the milk, or was it the comfort, the tactile comfort, these sorts of things. And put all these different surrogate mothers, basically inanimate mothers, a piece of wood covered in fleece. And then he would have monster mothers that would emit spikes, metal spikes that would actually hurt the baby. But the baby was so desperate for tactile comfort that the baby would cling tighter to this monster mother. That's what Harlow did in the late 60s, early 70s. Harlow at UW-Madison was doing that. One of his graduate students is a guy named Stephen Sumi, and he went on to work at the National Institutes of Health. So NIH, in addition to funding experimenters across the country and around the world, also has its own laboratories. There are about 300,000 animals in labs at NIH in Bethesda, Maryland. Which is a suburb of DC. So Sumi went there to NIH and he had his own laboratory where he was doing maternal deprivation experiments as well. What Sumi was doing was that he was breeding monkeys so that they would be genetically predisposed to being more depressed, more anxious, more fearful than I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
It's terrible.
Your face your face says it all. I mean, yes, it's horrible. It's like, who are these people and how did they dream up these horror shows? But That's Stephen Sumi. So he was doing this. He would selectively breed monkeys so that they would be genetically predisposed to, these various mental deficits, I guess, just difficulties coping with the world. And if that weren't bad enough, on the day the infants were born, he would take them away permanently from their mothers. And then he would enroll the monkeys in a battery of behavioral tests to see how they responded in various in various circumstances, things like human intruder tests, where somebody goes and stands in front of the monkey, staring at them to see their response. So these things were videotaped. Anyway, long story short, we obtained the video footage and the experimental protocols from NIH through a Freedom of Information Act request. Through Dr. Jane Goodall, she brokered a meeting with us, with some higher ups at NIH. So we met with the deputy director of NIH, so second in command. And they also sent their communications people. And so I'll never forget this, because we were sitting there with them describing how horrible these experiments are and how worthless they are. That Stephen Sumi had been doing this for 35 years at that point, had not advanced, because he was a graduate student with Harlow in the early 70s, moved over to NIH, had his cushy government job in this laboratory with the government. But, hadn't advanced our understanding of human mental illness. There was not one drug or treatment, that would allay, when people are clinically depressed or clinically anxious, nothing. Just a lot of published papers. And that's exactly, as we were making our case that these experiments were indefensible, what Kathy Hudson, who was the deputy director of NIH, said to us was, well, he's published a lot of papers and he, has received a lot of money and he has the support of his colleagues. So what do you say to that? And, what do you say to that? You say, hello, the emperor has no clothes.
Yes, exactly.
This is not, the yardstick that we should be using to measure whether these experiments have value or not. But it's the yardstick that's been employed, and not only in government labs, but at universities, private labs, everything.
Will you talk about the published papers, how that kind of keeps the whole thing rolling?
Most people have heard the expression publish or perish. And in universities, I used to work at a university. I was a tenured faculty member in mathematics. But, in that university system, the concept of publish or perish is that in order to gain tenure, you have to publish papers in journals, peer-reviewed journals. So the idea is you're advancing knowledge in your area of expertise. I worked in fluid dynamics, so I wrote papers on fluid dynamics. I know, Jan, I hope I haven't lost, most of your listenership, but that's what I did. And, these other people are writing papers on maternal deprivation experiments, or whether, excessive consumption of alcohol increases infidelity among male voles, or, when pregnant monkeys eat a junk food diet, and I should say are forced to eat a junk food diet, whether that's going to impact the emotional well-being of their offspring. So that's what these other people are publishing, all of these sorts of studies. And it's a peer review process. So when the experimenter writes their manuscript, that manuscript, they submit it to a journal for consideration for publication. Then that manuscript is sent to a bunch of peers, which are other animal experimenters. And they say, oh yeah, this is a great paper. This is really going to advance our understanding of alcohol and infidelity, or, Mediterranean diets versus junk food diets. This is going to really, really help. And so all these people say, yeah, check, excellent science, really important, whatever. And then the thing gets published. Having a lot of publications allows people, academics, to get tenure and then to get promotions. So, assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, all of that and all the rewards that come with it, higher salary, more job security, everything, is wrapped up in having a lot of publications. The problem is that the whole peer review system is basically, the fox is guarding the hen house, if that's the correct expression.
Right.
But it's basically you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and everybody, sort of in lockstep, saying, yes, this is a good system. We use animals, and it's fine.
Yeah.
So it's a self-perpetuating atrocity.
And so another paper's published. Here's another $1 million. Go work on the same thing again and again for the next decade.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. It helps with the grant funding as well.
The USDA is supposed to be doing a lot of inspections and whatnot, but they don't even go into NIH labs. Who's doing the inspecting there?
No one. The USDA is required by law to inspect university laboratories, commercial laboratories, minimum of once a year. And they write up an inspection report, summarizing any of the violations of the Animal Welfare Act. We at PETA will be the first to say the Animal Welfare Act is wholly inadequate. It's largely, governs husbandry issues. Are the animals being fed once a day? Are the animals being kept in cages that are large enough, which is embarrassing. And basically it means that they can stand up, sit down, turn around. That's the essence of what the measurements are of the cages that are permitted. So the Animal Welfare Act is embarrassingly low standards. And the USDA goes in once a year. And, the USDA has too few inspectors. I think the number is around 120 right now, inspectors. And they're not just inspecting laboratories, they're inspecting the puppy mills and the exhibitors like the zoos, the roadside zoos. They're inspecting, any circuses that are left that use animals. Those are being inspected by USDA officials, marine parks, marine amusement parks like SeaWorld, that sort of thing. Those are inspected by USDA inspectors. There are about 12,000 facilities that are inspected by USDA inspectors and 120 inspectors. So you can well imagine that a lot of these inspections are pretty perfunctory. In fact, we've had investigators, our undercover investigators at facilities that were our investigators were there at the facility when the USDA inspector came in. And I love to tell the story, if I may.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. About this one facility. It was in North Carolina. It was a contract laboratory, and they used dogs and cats and also rabbits in their testing protocols. And all of the animals were being abused, and smacked and shaken, and these employees were just awful. And they were doing the rabbits were used to grow ticks. So they would put like little tick nymphs, like the eggs, basically. So pre-nymphs, but the eggs were placed basically on a one-sided petri dish onto the bodies of the rabbits, and they were taped on. And so then the eggs would hatch, the nymphs would be there, then they would grow, then they would feed off of the rabbit. So, if anybody has ever been bitten by a mosquito or worse, bitten by a tick, you know how itchy it is. But imagine, hundreds of ticks on your body and you can't do anything because that area is inaccessible to you because it's been taped off and you're just getting bitten and bled. So they would grow the ticks so they could sell the ticks to other companies. Anyway, this place was just a hellhole. And, the animals are kept in ramshackle conditions, improper drainage. They had sores on their bodies. The dogs had these lick granulomas, and there was no veterinary care for these animals. It was just awful. But the inspector came, our investigator was right there, and everybody in the lab knew when the inspector was going to come. Broadly speaking, it's supposed to be unannounced, but the inspectors would always come in, May, June area. So they knew to be prepared. So they were spray painting, any rusted cages. This is the sort of thing inspectors look at. They were spraying over these areas so things would look good. They euthanized animals who were really far gone, so that the inspector would never see these animals who are in really bad shape. But the inspector came. There were about 250 animals there. She spent 3 hours at the facility that has 250 animals. An hour of that was looking at records, an hour of that was chatting with employees, interviewing them, but really chatting, right, over a cup of coffee. And then an hour was just walking through the facility pretty quickly. And she found one violation that was sort of, not a really important violation. And it was mostly administrative in nature. So they had this inspection report. So 2 months later, we presented all of our findings to the USDA: the lack of veterinary care, the deplorable conditions, the overt abuse. And they were so shocked by what we presented to them, such a contrast to what their inspector had documented in her report, that they actually sent a whole team of veterinarians down to this facility in North Carolina and started doing an inventory of all the animals and really looking at their condition, writing it all up. And then they went to the facility and they said, okay, you have two choices here. Either you surrender all the animals to us, or you, or you face the consequences and we'll shut you down. Yeah. So the facility surrendered the animals and they were shut down. And this is 2015, I think, when this happened. But it just goes to show that, there's this whole fiction that somehow these inspections are, that the inspections are ensuring that there's a certain, level, a certain standard of care that's being ensured, but they're not. But as you point out, Beth, what's even worse is that government laboratories like NIH's laboratories are not being inspected at all.
Do you get surprised anymore by the things you come across, not only the horrible experiments, but just the way it works, the way the government works, the way the money train works?
I do. And it's one of these issues where you think, you've seen it all, but you haven't. I just never knew the depths of human cruelty or just the lack of any sensibilities that these animals' lives matter and they feel pain. So very recently, we received a batch of reports from NIH, and that included an incident in which a marmoset, these are 1 pound monkeys, these little New World monkeys, who are used in laboratories, and at NIH, they use them in these infectious disease experiments. So this marmoset had been infected with tuberculosis, with TB. And when he was being taken out of a cage, he escaped. They're very nimble, they're fast, and he escaped and made it into the HVAC system. And the experimenters, in all their wisdom and supposed intellectual superiority, weren't able to lure him down. So he's up there in the HVAC system, in the tubing. They can't bring him down. So they decided, okay, we're just going to pump carbon dioxide in there and kill him. And that's what they did. And I mean, I just think about that marmoset and think of him being trapped. Okay, so first of all, he's got TB because he's been infected with TB. So he's sick. He's the sick little 1 pound monkey who is already traumatized for being sick, for being in these artificial conditions, small cages, deprived of a real family, deprived of the companionship that he desires, probably singly housed because he's been infected with an infectious disease. And he has this opportunity to escape. He goes, just is like desperate to escape. He's made it into this place which is dark and scary. He's probably hungry. And then all of this carbon dioxide comes filling in. And, if people don't know, big concentrations of carbon dioxide cause burning sensations in your mucosal tissues. So your nose, your eyes, your throat, your lungs, they just start burning. And then you die. But if it's a lower concentration, you have a sense of what's called air hunger. It's like conscious drowning. You feel like, you can't, people have probably experienced this, like I can't catch, I can't get air into my lungs. I'm like gasping for air. And that's, and then that happens and you die. And that's how this poor animal died. And, these experimenters, they're so arrogant and they think they're so smart and they don't have protocols to make sure that these animals don't escape. And when they do escape, they can't figure out a way to retrieve the animal. And then the best way they can think of retrieving the animal is killing the animal in this like incredibly cruel way. Like in Europe, they don't permit carbon dioxide gassing of mice and rats because it's so cruel. It's considered cruel and not euthanasia. And so for a larger animal, like a 1 pound marmoset, to kill the animal by carbon dioxide gassing is beyond the pale. And this is NIH. We support them with our tax dollars. Every cent that's being used, and I'm pointing in that direction because Bethesda is 5 miles from where I'm sitting right now. And it's a very beautiful campus, beautiful buildings, beautiful landscaping. Every cent that has gone into those buildings, gone into the labs, gone into the animals, gone into the people's salary, every single cent comes from us, the US taxpayers. And it's horrendous what they do. They're so arrogant and they can't think of a better way. They couldn't have dismantled the HVAC system. They decided to do that. This lack of care just stuns me.
The majority of this stuff doesn't do anything to advance science or advance medicine. The great majority.
The great hoax. Yes, you're absolutely right, Beth. Correct, Beth. And in fact, there was a paper that was published in the British Medical Journal, I think in 2014, because, in the last, say, 20 years, more and more scientists have been looking at the question that you just raised. Are these experiments actually helping human beings? And the thing is, what they wrote in this article in the British Medical Journal, which is not an animal rights publication, it is a peer-reviewed, highly respected journal. And what they wrote in the BMJ is that it has been taken as an article of faith. It has been taken as an article of faith that experimenting on animals will help human beings. But when we actually look at what's going on and look at the data and see what's coming out of the animal laboratories, these, findings that we read about in the New York Times and other publications that, transcribe what the experimenters tell them. When we look at all of that and see whether that has actually helped human beings in a clinical setting, the answer is no. These are two distinct worlds. Yeah, human studies, epidemiological studies, population studies, these other things, the modern non-animal human relevant methods like organs on a chip and organoids and these other things. Yeah, that's informing what's going on over here with human clinical solutions. But the animal people, they're just interested in writing publications and getting grants and, carving out a pretty sweet life for themselves. So no, it's not helping.
What needs to happen to change, to get science to really pay attention to human relevant methods and to stop this whole thing?
Well, probably a lot of things need to happen. One thing that we're seeing that's really great is that the public is coming on board. So if you went back 40 years, 30 years, you'd see that the great majority of people had unqualified support. They gave unqualified support to animal experimentation. Everybody just believed, it's probably done humanely, don't want to see it, but it's probably fine. And it's important for us, if we want cures to Alzheimer's, cures to different types of cancers, cures to Parkinson's, et cetera, this is what we need to do. But today we're seeing that actually a majority of Americans, and this is according to Pew, the Pew Research Council, a majority of Americans actually oppose the use of animals in experimentation. So we're seeing this great sea change in the perspectives. The other thing that we need and that we've been seeing a lot of in the last 20 years is an understanding that animal experiments don't work. We are different biologies, different biological systems. You just can't translate from one species to another. You can't translate from mice to rats. How do you expect to translate from mice and rats to human beings? We've established that, and I think Lisa Jones-Engel, when she was on your show, she talked about this, that we've established, the scientific community has understood that we can't translate from chimpanzees our closest living relatives to human beings. So if we can't translate from chimpanzees to human beings, why do we think we can translate from monkeys who are, evolutionarily speaking, and therefore genetically and in other ways speaking, more different from us than chimpanzees? How do we translate from them to human beings? We can't, and the data shows it. And then all of the other species, down the whole chain of existence. But, I think that the science is coming up in a very big way, and I think it's demonstrably clear with the data, 95% failure rate in drugs, in drug testing, 90% failure of highly promising findings from animal research, don't translate to clinical meaningful treatments or cures for human beings. When you look at all this, it's pretty clear, but we need that to really sink in with the scientific community. We need that to happen. We need journals to be more selective. We need less bias in the publishing industry, so that the peer review isn't just all these other animal experimenters looking at it. But if it's a paper that purports to have some new finding about Parkinson's disease, that it's actually people who are looking at Parkinson's human patients and people who do human relevant research that are looking at this paper and saying, well, this is actually a whole lot of BS, right? This isn't going to help human beings ever, so this should not be published. So we need that system to change. We need the grant system to change. For example, at the National Institutes of Health, which disperses about $20 billion, a bit more every year, to animal experiments. That granting system is based on, the committees are called study sections. So again, if I'm an animal experimenter who works on Parkinson's, my grant application, I want money from the NIH, I submit a grant application. So that committee looks at my application. Most of those people are animal experimenters. So it's like an entrenched system. So we sort of have to liberate ourselves from these entrenched ways of being, whether it's from funding or the grants, or the university system. So all these things need to change.
The whole damn system needs to change. And it's not one of those things like other things where you can be like, well, demand needs to change because people don't have control. It's a harder thing to get people to be able to take individual action to shut down.
I agree with you, of course. But I would say that, one of the first issues that I became aware of when I became a grassroots activist, during my student days, so it was like the early mid 1980s, like 83 or 84. One of the first issues that I became aware of was cosmetics testing on animals. Mascara and blush being dripped into rabbits' eyes and, that sort of thing. And I was really horrified. So as I said, this is 1983, 1984. And I was just so shocked by it and so revolted by what was going on that I decided, okay, not going to buy any more cosmetics that are tested on animals. So I looked around and my only option back then was to mail order for, I know. And there was a company called Compassionate Consumer, I think in upstate New York somewhere. But, and I would order from them, and it wasn't just cosmetics. It was, personal care products like shampoo or toothpaste. And then also things like laundry detergent, cleaners, things like that. So that was 1983. So yeah, a long time ago. Okay. Granted, I'm old. So it was 40 years ago. That's what I was doing. But today I could walk into a Target, I can walk into a CVS, and find a whole bunch of things. The point is that there are thousands, and I can't remember, I think it's more than 6,000 companies now that don't test on animals. But that happened because of consumer demand. Totally. So I think that the public, even though we're not consumers in the same way with animal experimentation, we are the public with a voice. And, when we, it's not hard to go and speak with your legislator, your elected representatives, whether it's your senators or your representatives in the House, or your local politicians to try to get change enacted. And, for example, at PETA, we have, as you know, the research modernization deal, and we're working with members of Congress to try to get NIH to adopt the research modernization deal so that there can be a shift away from antiquated, unreliable animal experiments to modern human relevant methods. These methods exist. They're fantastic and they're more reliable. They're in many cases faster, and with time will be cheaper than using animals. And of course, they're humane.
What happened if that 20 billion every year went into human relevant methods? We probably would have cured a lot of stuff. Right?
Exactly, Beth. I mean, it's also that, human patients have been sold a bill of goods, and, they and their families deserve better.
Alka, thank you for this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an honor to speak with you, Beth.
To learn more about Dr. Chandna's work, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We will have links to everything. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, review on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like to support Species Unite, we would greatly appreciate it. Go to our website, speciesunite.com, and click donate. I'd like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knudsen, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polke, Ayanna Peoples, and Anna Kallner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.